the differences between those of us who hold the views that parental alienation is valid and those people who are opposed to those views. And the idea of the dialogue is to try to express the differences and build bridges to see if we can understand each other a bit better. That there are groups of people who I think are politically motivated who hold very extreme views. And the big difference is that the parental alienation movement, the what I call the college of knowledge around that, is focused on what the science and the evidence tells us about it. And so we're constantly responding to critics by improving the science. So we benefit from criticism on that front. But what we observe about some of these extreme views is that their ideology requires them to dispose of any science with which they don't agree. So if there's any evidence that opposes their views, they dispose of the evidence first and stick with the ideology. So a good example of that was the United Nations Special Rapporteur's report on violence against women and children. And what was in that report was flagrantly unscientific. A monumental demonstration of confirmation bias. The outcome was clearly stated that they decided it up front, and they were looking for the evidence to support it and not looking for evidence that didn't support it. And so it was a hash of myths and untruths and falsities about parental alienation that they had put together in a report to make it look credible. So I was one of the responding authors to challenge the validity of that report. And there are other examples. The Centre for Judicial Excellence in the US did a similar report, the same materials, the same approach. I find it very hard to see how we can build bridges with zealots because they're not amenable to logic and they're not curious. And that was one of the observations I made in the UN Special Rapporteur's report, is in pursuit of their ideology, which is basically to abolish the family. They're just not being honest about that. They don't care about what casualties they have in doing it. That means that the people they're trying to protect, that they're supposedly championing, mothers and children, they don't care if they die in the process, figuratively or literally. And we know that's the case because alienated mothers often have nowhere to go. There are lots of men's groups for alienated fathers. I'm a member of one in Australia that does that. But there's not so many for alienated mothers. It's very difficult to bring them together. And so when they turn to family violence organisations who are following those extreme ideologies, they refuse to acknowledge them because there's no such thing. So this is a funny thing that's happened in Australia. We have what we call family violence resource centres, the government funded, and they deal with women who are escaping from family violence and need legal help and other support. When they get a mother who says they've been alienated from their children, they refer her to me. They either won't deal with her or can't because politically it's not congruent with what they believe. That's a really odd situation. The good news is they were prepared to refer her on, but if there was nowhere for her to go, they would have just let her go. They would have said, we can't help you. Parental alienation is a particularly dangerous and insidious form of family violence. I actually call it politically motivated intimate terror. And yet, they're okay if women and children suffer for the sake of their ideology. This is straight out of Stalin. There's an interesting book out there if anyone is curious about it. I certainly don't want to increase book sales on this one. It's called Abolish the Family. And I think the author is Sophie Lewis. Now, it's one of several books on that same theme. And these are, and I'll call them extreme feminists to distinguish them from mainstream feminists. These extreme feminists see no role for the family in contemporary society. They want to get rid of the family, and that somehow children will be brought up by some kind of matrix of social relationships. So there's no sense that a biological parent means anything more than anyone else in society with whom the child has a relationship. That falls out of a very radical Marxist philosophy that holds the family as a threat to the state. Because if you think about a family, it's like a sealed container. You know, parents bring up their children according to the values they want their children to have. And the state usually has no way of influencing that beyond the front door of the house. Karl Marx doesn't like that. So he was not a fan of the family at all. And if you look at second wave feminism in the 1970s, that's where the idea came from. That in those days, back then, women fighting for equality and equity thought of the family as a site of patriarchy, a site of oppression of women. I think historically they were probably right about that, because traditionally the man was the head of the house, and these were old paradigms they were trying to change for good reason. But I think they were reacting to the resistance they were facing, and then took increasingly radical approaches like, well, if it's not working, we'll get rid of the families. That's still going today. So when we see books like Abolish the Family, End Marriage Now, those sorts of things, those 1970s extreme views are alive and well. And parental alienation is a means of achieving their aims. Because one parent unilaterally decides, I'm not going to parent with you anymore, and then uses parental alienating behaviours to get the child to reject that parent for no valid reason other than their political motives. Does that mean that an alienating parent is a politician? Not necessarily, but we know that people with certain dispositions, mental health issues, personality issues, are vulnerable to extreme ideas. So they're getting the message that it's okay to do this. It's okay to weaponise my child without regard to their welfare, get rid of mum or dad. They're not necessarily thinking politically, but what they're doing fits a politicised model. And so they are the soldiers, the disposable soldiers recruited by the politicians who are advocating this philosophy to governments in many jurisdictions, which is why there's an incredible amount of funding to deal with what they call gendered family violence, and very little funding to deal with ruptured parent-child relationships. In Australia, one woman dies every 11 days from what they call gendered family violence. Yes, that's horrible. So it's an outrage. It's treated as a social epidemic. 10 women and 15 men die from suicide every 11 days due to disruptions to family relationships from separation and divorce. Of that proportion, by definition, some of them are alienated. No one says a word about that. You know, we have an outrage because one woman dies every 11 days, but no outrage about 10 women dying from suicide every 11 days, let alone 15 men. We have another thing in Australia where, in the state I live in, the police want to reopen cases of suicide where mothers have died from suicide who were victims of family violence. They want to reclassify those deaths as family violence deaths rather than suicide. So I wrote an article saying, well, if that's the case, if you've got a suicide due to parental alienation, you should reclassify those as family violence deaths as well. Where that points to is this idea that if we want to see change, we have to convert the science that we do and lift it into the policy space. We have to start talking socioeconomics. What are the economic costs of suicide? What are the economic costs of ruptured family relationships? We know that alienated children, disproportionately draw on social resources and mental health, education elsewhere, they, for the rest of their lives possibly. We know that alienated parents are harmed by exposure to those behaviours. We also know that alienating parents behave the way they do because they were made that way, not born that way. So they need help as well. So we need to have this argument of allocating public funds to those issues to strengthen family relations as a centre point of society.